One of the reasons that research has indicated is that some people seem to have damage to the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is the executive center of the brain, the part of the brain that processes logical thinking, understanding, that analyzes and evaluates and comes to conclusions, and it also understands consequences to actions. So that part of the brain is what maintains the logical balance within my mind, if I can put it that way. We have a reasonable brain that is responsible for thinking and logic. We have an emotional brain, which is responsible for emotions and feelings, and where a lot of our patternings and programs are formulated. And then we have the reptilian brain, which is the survival brain, which gets triggered by risks or threats. And in combination, these three parts of the brain then will determine the action that I need to take. A healthy prefrontal cortex will help me to maintain logic and reasoning in the situation and make wise decisions in response to maybe the fear that was triggered within the midbrain, within the emotional brain through stress hormones. And then the triggering of the reptilian brain, I need to take action in order to protect myself, in order to survive the threat. Now, when there is an impairment in the logical part of the brain, and that sort of can include impulse control. It can also include being irrational, maybe making irrational decisions, not thinking things through. And that may trigger the response system within the brain, the emotions and the survival mechanisms within the brain, and that could override any logical thinking. And that could be why some people are more inclined to anger outbursts, road rage, maybe violence, because there is this impairment within the logical part of the brain. And that can be investigated through various scans and tests. So it's important for anybody who maybe relate to this, where they have an inability to control themselves when they are triggered, to maybe have that checked out. So the release of stress hormones, as well as a potential impairment to the prefrontal cortex, as well as a deficiency in serotonin levels in the brain, may be the cause for so-called anger issues, rage, anger outbursts, violence, etc. What is serotonin? Serotonin is one of the so-called feel-good chemicals, and one of the many functions of serotonin is to make me feel calm, to make me feel relaxed, to make me feel satisfied, to make me feel peaceful. And a healthy brain will have a healthy balance between the release of various chemicals, the stress hormones and the feel-good chemicals. And for somebody who has a serotonin deficiency, it means they are more inclined to be hypervigilant, are more inclined to be stressed, they're more inclined to notice threats and danger more than others. They may be at risk of being triggered, causing the release of huge amounts of stress hormones in the brain that could trigger the reptilian brain, and where they are more inclined to react then as opposed to respond, because apart from not being able to process the situation logically and reasonably because of impairment to the prefrontal cortex, there's also the low levels of serotonin or deficiency of serotonin that helps me to stay calm, that helps me to be able to evaluate the situation, and that puts the individual at greater risk of anger outbursts, rage, etc. Another hugely important principle to understand, that the primary cause for the release of stress hormones, any chemicals for that matter in the brain and the nervous system, the main or the primary cause for that is my thinking or the narrative of anger in response to a situation. I think most of us, if not all of us, at some level have been conditioned to blame external situations, to blame people. You made me angry. The situation is making me frustrated. That is an incorrect statement. Yes, a person definitely can play a role, a situation definitely can play a role, but the way that the brain functions is I cannot have a direct experience of a situation until the situation or the information about the situation has been processed in my brain and there is a chemical response to that mental processing. In other words, I first have to think about a situation. I first have to tell myself a story about what is happening that causes the release of various chemicals in the brain that causes the feeling response. So it is not the situation that is making me frustrated. It is not the person that is making me angry. It is the story that I'm telling myself about what is happening. And there are various contributing factors that determine what the kind of story is that I'm telling myself, and in turn will determine what kind of feeling or emotion it is that I'm experiencing. The situation in itself only contributes around 10% to my feelings of anger, while my angry thoughts contribute around 90%. And it is so important for us to get our heads around this. Otherwise, we may be at risk of remaining victims. We may be at risk of blaming and projecting, and that will keep us to remain stuck in reactive mode and causing us to behave in ways that may be harmful to ourselves and others. So how it works, there is a circumstance, there is a situation that triggers thoughts. I tell myself a story, and that is very often the result of past experiences, beliefs that I may hold. I may have an unconscious or subconscious belief that you can't trust people, or the world is dangerous, or I don't deserve any good, and that could contribute towards the quality of the story that I react to in response to a circumstance or a situation. Those thoughts then cause my feelings. The circumstances do not cause my feelings. My thoughts cause my feelings because of the biochemical reaction that creates my emotions. Those feelings then cause my actions, my behavior, how I react, how I respond. Do I react aggressively and violently, or do I react with reason and logic? And that ultimately creates the results. And that is the evidence then. The result will be the evidence of the quality of my thoughts. The results are not the evidence of the quality of the situation. So that cycle will continue until I find a way to interrupt that cycle, should that cycle be destructive, and if there is nothing that I can do about the situation to change it. There's very little I can do about the feelings, because the feelings are the results of chemicals that have been released into my system, into my bloodstream, and once those chemicals have been released, there's nothing much I can do to change my feelings until I address the thinking, the story, what I am saying to myself. And one important way of addressing this would be to make the story as clinical and as factual as I can. Instead of saying this person hurt me, this person disrespects me, this person treated me badly, I'm shocked, I'm disappointed, and that story or that narrative causing the release of huge amounts of stress hormones within my body, and me feeling stress and anger and frustration, and leading to destructive or negative actions and creating negative results, I can reframe the story by purely sticking to the facts and making the story as short and clinical as possible. And that will contribute towards the reduction of the release of stress hormones. And in that process, I'll be able to remain clear-minded, and I will be able to address the situation. Anger is often called a secondary emotion because we tend to resort to anger in order to protect ourselves from other vulnerable feelings. And very often people feel insecure when it comes to negative emotions. And particularly in our Western society, for some reason, we've been conditioned that certain emotions, certain feelings are negative, are bad, are unacceptable. So we may find it easier to react in anger as opposed to express or talk about how we feel. There is what is known as the anger iceberg, the anger that shows, masks feelings maybe of hurt, of humiliation, of frustration, of fear, of rejection, and we project those insecurities as anger. And the anger masks whatever it is that we're feeling underneath, and for whatever reason that we may not be able to express or process. So an important principle that should we be stuck in anger, in rage, in negative behavior as a result, it may be important for us to examine and to explore what other unresolved emotions there may be that we have not found a way to address or to resolve. Anger in itself is not considered a disorder. Rage or violence, violent behavior in itself is not a disorder, but anger is a known symptom of several mental health conditions. And very often the frustration that some people may experience because they have or they experience some mental health conditions or disorders may translate into anger. And the anger could be a sign that there may be some unresolved mental health conditions that may need to be addressed. 4 of the main potential mental health disorders that may be the result, or that may be the cause, I should say, of anger could be anxiety. Anxiety, a deep sense of fear and insecurity, way more than just feeling nervous or feeling scared of something specific. Very often it can be unreasonable, inexplicable, and I may have a fear of the outside world. I may have a fear of communicating with others. And the frustration very often that is the result of anxiety could lead to anger. Depression, where I find I'm stuck into in a dark place, a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, unable to deal with situations, could also cause frustration that could ultimately lead to anger. Bipolar mood disorder, where I swing from feelings of mania or intense pleasurable feelings to deep depression. Again, the frustration that can be caused by that could lead to anger. Intermittent explosive disorder, the inability to control my impulses, the inability to control my emotions, where I become very reactive or explosive. And these are all potential areas that may need to be explored should I be stuck in rage and violent negative outbursts. There are some physical symptoms that may also accompany high levels of anger issues, feelings of rage, and some of the symptoms are headaches, fatigue, always feeling exhaustion, heart palpitations, tightening of the chest, finding it difficult to breathe, feelings of pressure in my head, pressure in my sinus cavities that contributes towards the headaches as well, increased blood pressure, and tingling in my fingers or extremities. And the reason for that would be the high levels of stress hormones being released into my system because of my constant thoughts of anger, frustration, and rage. And the biochemical reaction over time will start to affect my body and can actually cause serious problems within these various areas and lead to disease ultimately that could have a very, very negative impact on my physical health. We're going to look at some of the effects of excess cortisol. Cortisol is one of the stress hormones that is released when we experience feelings of anger. Anger very often starts off with adrenaline, when I feel that there's a feeling of being alive and focused when I'm angry, which in itself could be positive because it could make me alert and aware to address whatever threat I may be facing. And if I don't deal with it, it then leads to the release of cortisol, and cortisol in excess will have the direct opposite effect of adrenaline, which starts to slow down my ability to think clearly. It starts to affect my body, and it can decrease my metabolism. It can cause depression. It can cause hypertension, high blood pressure, chronic fatigue, sleep deprivation, migraines, tunnel vision, in that I'm unable to be objective with regards to situations that I may be facing, acid reflux disease, that burning sensation in my body because of acid, the movement of acidic substances within my system, hostility, feelings of distrust, hunger, and that could also potentially lead to eating disorders for some people, arthritis, aches and pains in my joints. And again, these are all the results of the increase of stress hormones within the system because of the constant state of hypervigilance that I may find myself in. If I have an issue with anger, if I am stuck in angry, negative thoughts that continue to cause this biochemical reaction within my system and can ultimately affect not only my brain, but can also affect my body and affect my mental health. Anger and stress causes hypofrontality. What is hypofrontality? That is cognitive impairment. And what that means is if I find myself in a state of stress, anger, frustration, what literally happens is the blood supply from the rest of the brain to the prefrontal cortex, the rational, logical, reasoning part of the brain, is interrupted. And if I can put it in simple terms, my prefrontal cortex goes offline. I can't think clearly. I can't make decisions. I can't make choices. And the reason for that is because the brain has gone into survival mode because of the triggering of the survival instinct, because of the release of stress hormones in the brain as a result of negative thinking within the prefrontal cortex. And the reason why the prefrontal cortex goes offline is because the brain interprets the fact that risk does not allow myself to think, because if I think too much, the risk or the threat may overwhelm me, may kill me for that matter if it's very extreme. So thinking is not safe, action is required. And because the limbic system, the midbrain and the reptilian brain, there is no logical thinking going on there. There is no interpretation, evaluation. It is purely an instinct for survival. Those two parts of the brain literally will overrule the logical reasoning part of the brain, and hyperfrontality kicks in, and I become purely reactive, and all because I did not find a way to interrupt this whole process and keep the rational, logical thinking brain going. Hyperfrontality kicks in and I become reactive, and sometimes with disastrous consequences. How do I manage my anger? It's actually far more simple than we think. In extreme cases, people may be prescribed medication. It's always important to realize that medication should always be secondary. Medication shouldn't be the only way in which I deal with situations. There are always other ways and means as well. If I can start to address what goes on in my mind, if I can start to practice new ways of thinking, and as I mentioned earlier on, if I can start to practice choosing what kind of story I tell myself in response to a situation, to move it from being very negative and overwhelming more to being clinical and factual. And from there, I can then maybe move towards giving it a different meaning. And we can start off by identifying triggers and warning signs. What are the specific things that I may be more sensitive to, and what can I do with it? Talk to somebody, share your feelings, and particularly the fact that anger very often is a secondary emotion. What are some of the maybe hidden or suppressed emotions that I may be feeling. Give them a voice. Share, talk about it. It also helps to bring relief. Try breathing or muscle relaxation. I mentioned the neurochemical or neurotransmitter serotonin that causes calmness and relaxation within the body. Deep, slow breathing promotes the release of serotonin that can bring calmness. And also relaxation exercises like mindfulness and meditation exercises also contributes towards the release of serotonin. And it brings about a sense of calmness within the nervous system. And as I said, reframe your thinking, change your story. Be aware of when I feel a very strong negative emotion, where I feel strong anger, frustration. What is the story I'm telling myself at this moment in time? How can I reframe that? Sometimes I may need to walk away from situations that I can't change. The more I try to resist, the more I try to force situations to change, the more stress it evokes within me, and the more it can increase my anger levels. So sometimes I just have to walk away. Walking or exercising, very, very important, very, very helpful, because exercise releases a whole range of the feel-good chemicals that can bring a sense of relief. All of this obviously starts off with the most important principle, and that is personal responsibility. As long as I blame, as long as I project, as long as I point fingers, nothing will ever change. And again, just to remind ourselves of some of the very important principles that we've looked at, no situation, no person can make me feel any way. It is always the meaning that I give to the situation that creates my feelings. So I create my own reality in this context. I create my emotions. So when I take personal responsibility and I start to ask the questions, what is going on here? How do I deal with it? What is it that I can do to improve the situation? That is where change and healing starts. If it's persistent, it is important to seek professional help, because, as I said, it may be a fact that the intense anger issues may mask other mental health conditions that may need to be addressed. We've come to the end of this presentation, and I hope that you were able to find some value in it. As I mentioned earlier on, should you have any questions, any queries, you're more than welcome to drop me a line at john.ttklife@gmail.com, john.ttklife@gmail.com. If you are able to relate to some of the things that we mentioned and would like to learn more, maybe go on a journey of personal development and growth, you can also inquire regarding online coaching that I do. I offer a 30-minute free consultation where you tell me what you're looking for, and I'll tell you how I go about it, and you can decide from there whether you want to explore that. So please feel free to get in touch with me. I wish you much success on your journey towards developing the life that you desire and deserve. All the best.